following thing. We will do the before lecture chant, okay? An unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas, having to see and listen to remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. We as a Sangha have been invited to enter an intensive practice period during this month of October. It is designated as a time to deepen our commitment to the Zen practice of sitting Zazen, maybe sitting longer, maybe sitting more regularly. Part of my deepening my practice, I made a decision that each day I would recite and reflect on the following poem written by Mugai Nyodai. She was a Japanese nun living in medieval Japan from 1223 to 1298 and was considered to be the first female Zen master. In this way and that, I tried to save the old bucket. Its braces weak and soon to break, until one day the bottom fell out. Then there was no more water in the bucket, no more moon shining in the bucket. I want you to please listen again, and this time accept any images or feelings or impressions that may surface in your mind. In this way and that, I tried to save the old bucket, its braces weak and soon to break, until one day the bottom fell out. Then there was no more water in the bucket, no more moon shining in the bucket. Kate, could you do us a favor and show the image of the wood block? I called it number 3. This is a famous woodblock print of Mugai Nyodai, made by the famous 19th century artist Yoshoshi. Notice the obvious female figure standing in pale moonlight, her broken and bottomless bucket at her feet, a puddle of water seeping across her path. Thanks, Kate. In our text, Women of the Way, Discovering 2,500 Years of Buddhist Women Wisdom, I have chosen to study the chapter about Mugai Nyodai. The poem I just shared was written by her as a reflection on her own enlightenment experience. As is the practice in Rinzai Zen, this poem was written following an enlightenment experience and then eventually became a teaching koan. Last week's Dharma talk on our Chinese female ancestor, Zhang Ji, given with such clarity and depth by Patty, it was stated through Zhang Ji's life experiences and awakening mind, she became disillusioned. That is, she began to live her life free of illusion. The poem I have just read, I believe, expresses metaphorically how Mugai, the poem's author, achieved enlightenment. That is, came to live her life free from illusion. According to Sally Tisdale, the author of this text, Chiono, who, when ordained and received Dharma transmission, became known as Mugai Nyodai, was born in 1223 into the shogunate clan of medieval Japan. This powerful shogunate clan was a hereditary military dictatorship of Japan all the way until 1867 and ruthlessly controlled the destiny of Japan. The author states Chiono was highly educated and studied poetry, music, read the classics, learned to speak and read Chinese, and possessed a very strong samurai nature. Her early in life religious studies were in Buddhism and Zen, but it was a version of Buddhism molded to fit the violence and power struggles of the politics and war. At age 20, she married into the Kanizawa clan, which was known for scholarship instead of samurai ways of violence and fighting. There she raised a daughter, helped manage the affairs of her husband's clan, and continued her practice from her younger days of writing long letters and poetry, as well as managing the financial affairs of the clan. At 40, her daughter left the clan, and at 54, Chiono was widowed. At that time, she defied the cultural expectations that a relatively young widow would return to her father's clan to devote herself to being his care provider. She had other plans for her life. Chiono became curious what Zen might be if it were not used to dominate one's political opponents and curry favor with the current emperor. She began daily to visit many temples, sometimes walking on foot, other times riding horseback, ignoring inclement weather, and always seeking to meet with the head teacher or abbot of each and every monastery. Interestingly, the Rinzai Zen monasteries of the day were required to allow women entry if they were from a samurai clan, which was her original family's clan. She often left these encounters with written sermons in hand, sometimes with numerous sutras, but almost always, according to Tisdale, with more questions than answers. Either by fate or karma, or maybe accident, Chiono read a sermon by a Chinese master named Wu She, who had recently begun residing in the newly built Engakuji temple. Tisdale writes, after reading his sermon, she went to meet Wu She, climbing the long hills slowly and with decorous steps, intensely polite, but completely unwilling to be turned away. She passed through layer and layer of hesitant monks until she reached the abbot's door. She was wholly qualified by then, an unmarried woman of a samurai family who wanted Zen training. Upon meeting her, Wu She waved away the young monks and met her as his peer, bowing calmly. I love their supposed initial exchange that went something like this. Wu She served his guests tea and asked, "How can I help you?" "What is Zen?" she asked while sipping her tea. It was reported she asked the same question at each monastery she visited. Wu She answered, "Zen is the heart of the one who asks, not someone else's words." She then responded, "So, why does the teacher give sermons that are recorded?" And he said, "With a deaf man, you show him the moon by pointing. With a blind man, you show him the gate by knocking on it." Chiono had finally found her teacher, and unlike the customs of the day, he remained her teacher, eventually giving her her very own room on the grounds. The other monks were less than thrilled at having a woman amongst their ranks. She became the water carrier of the monastery, and it's believed that this was probably assigned to her because it caused her to be gone many hours each and every day. The story goes that for many years, Chiono carried water and sat for seamlessly endless hours of meditation. She longed for higher ranking stations in the monastery and wished to be free of her deep grief from being a widow. Again, I quote Tisdale, "But one hot summer evening under a full moon, when she bent to scoop water into her bucket, its bottom fell out and gone at once," she realized, was all that had bound her small, false self. Without a bottom, a bucket is not a bucket anymore. Without the boundary of ego, a self is no more separate from the world than a drop of rain is separate from the ocean. Soon after, Chiono wrote and shared with Wu She her poem you heard earlier, and he in turn presented her with a priest's robe of gold and white brocade. She was now officially Mugai Nyodai, the first female Zen master in Japan, and went on to live a life dedicated to teaching Buddhist thought to all who came to the gates of the numerous convents that she started. This is a lovely story that only gets more interesting when toward the end of her life, a distant male relative, a Zen monk, who upon becoming an abbot, refused to accept her as a true lineage holder. Mugai, a dedicated Zen master, quietly slid into obscurity. But fast forward a mere 700 years later, a professor, Barbara Rush, a Japan scholar in the 1970s, when surveying a book of portraits of Zen abbots, spotted a person she felt had a rather feminine set of features. Kate, could we see what I'd labeled as number one? I'm uncertain I would have caught the features that piqued Professor Rush's curiosity. She began to focus all of her research on Mugai and her heritage. According to Grace Shearson, my first teacher in this book entitled Zen Women Beyond Tea Ladies, Iron Maidens, and Macho Masters. According to Grace, the professor went on to create the Institute for the Study of Medieval Japan to answer the questions Mugai's existence raised, and is primarily dedicated to finding, translating, and disseminating the work of Mugai Nyodai. Professor Rush, Shearson states, can be seen as one of our modern day founders. Thank you, Kate, for sharing Mugai. So where do we go from here? We know a few of the key moments in Mugai Nyodai's life. We have seen a stylized image of her enlightenment and heard a version of the poem she wrote to capture that event. Modern day Zen practitioners have written deeply personal reflections on what Nyodai's poem or koan meant to them. Merle Kodo Boyd, a student of Bernie Glassman who received Dharma transmission, wrote in this book, the hidden lamp, that she was born in the deep South and was one of those Black children raised to enter newly integrated schools. She wrote that in those circumstances, everything seemed to ride on keeping it together, especially in public. This hypervigilance was required in order to prevent disaster. Interestingly, it was that same courage she found she needed to enter a Zen center, a place she suspected where no one would look like her. She was drawn to Zen in hopes of finding a place to experience her life in the world more deeply. A faith that teaches no self could bring her the much desired personal liberation she sought. Nonetheless, she states, she relied on being outwardly upright while keenly aware of her inner fears. Her lifelong dedicated Zen practice brought her to the liberation she sought, where, as she states, I was allowed to disappear like the water and the moon, moving between patched bucket and bottomless bucket. I can exercise my freedom to keep things together or let things come apart, according to the circumstances. I have come to trust the true freedom of living where the moon does not dwell. And I thought an interesting side note in Boyd's story she shared was that she kept that wood block image that we posted of Mugai above her desk at all times. Yesterday, I attended our half-day retreat, and I'm so grateful I did. Patty led us in using Lectio Divina to explore freely our thoughts on a particular Zen story. We were encouraged to listen, then read, then put pen to paper and write whatever entered our minds. We were told to not hold back, not worry about form, but rather to keep that pen moving. It was a refreshing exercise, a gentle move toward personal liberation, a move from keeping our ego/bucket always intact. Following the retreat, I knew I wanted to share a personal perspective on Mugai's poem and tell of a particular life event where I could not keep it together any longer. To do this, I had to ignore an inner voice telling me, you have not achieved enlightenment from the event, and that is true. But I was profoundly humbled, deeply shaken, and learned in a real way not to mistake the seeming for the real. That is, the reflection of the moon in the bucket for the real orb in the sky. This, I'm going to share with you, is my stream of consciousness writing. In my mid-40s, my two daughters were young adults and had boomeranged back home with me to continue their college careers, one doing undergrad work, one post-grad. When summer came, I decided to visit a family friend, a former Peace Corps volunteer, working as an urban regional planner in American Samoa. I did love to travel. I found the country, actually a US protectorate, alluring and beautiful. People were friendly and children were so appealing. I began to hatch a plan. 10 years of working in early intervention, serving children with significant disabilities and their families, I understood the intent of the law. But were families here receiving any of the federally mandated services? As luck or fate or karma would have it, I ventured out to American Samoa's Cost You Less, a knockoff of Costco. And while waiting to check out, a woman pushed her cart behind me, and in the cart was about an 18-month-old cute little girl with Down syndrome. I engaged the child a bit, my common practice, and then asked Mom if she and her daughter were involved in any kind of a special program. She confirmed she was and asked me why I asked. I explained I was a speech pathologist working in a 0 to 3 program in California. Without being asked, she wrote the director's name and phone number on a slip of paper and told me I must call. The program needed me. A few weeks later, we took a small plane, my friend and I, about a 6-seater to the Samoan island of Ofu. On that flight, I put my own travel bag in the rear luggage compartment of the plane, and upon arrival in Ofu, I hoisted it out and went to our room. I was flabbergasted to begin unpacking and find an empty glass bottle of which I knew nothing about, labeled as an over-the-counter medicine called gripe water, treatment for babies with colic and general fussiness. It sealed the deal. I would consider returning to American Samoa and would call the director when we flew back. She invited us to dinner at her home and showered me with traditional Samoan gifts of fabric and jewelry, these earrings, and offered me a job. I asked for a year to consider the offer, and in 1 year signed a 2-year contract and returned to work in Pongo Pongo's Lyndon B. Johnson's Tropical Medical Center, Part H infant program, as a speech pathologist and director of their 1-day-a-week center-based program. The remainder of my time would be assessing children in their home environment, devising individualized service plans, and coordinating with other agencies to meet these families' needs, or so I thought. Within a few days, I discovered none of the 3 staff members of this Part H infant program had made any contact with families for the previous 6 months. And it was a year-round program funded at $500,000 annually. Our center-based program was housed in a corner of a convent. This is where I traveled to be with these families who rode in on provided buses. In this convent, we had a linoleum floor, no furniture, no play equipment, no changing facilities. I loved my time with these families and made the best out of a very miserable situation. We did a lot of singing and dancing, and I found a back closet with some toys and equipment, but they hadn't been used in years. When they began to trust me, they told tales of abuse, how difficult it was to ride the bus with these young children, at times taking 1 to 2 hours to get to the facility. And if they missed even one of the classes, the boss, whom I affectionately referred to as boss bitch, would end their food stamps. I uncovered plenty of evidence of misuse of funds, including this convent receiving $100,000 a year for a bare floor. I found out later it was associated with her favorite church. I made it my practice to overlook these fiscal issues until she refused to buy me a Samoan to English dictionary for $7 or to order basic assessment kits. I went into whistleblower mode and sent the FBI hundreds of documents showing the extent of her embezzlement and fraud. During my trip home at Christmas, our nurse confided in me that the director had broken into my desk and found 1 fax I had accidentally left behind. Upon my return, all file cabinets were locked and I was restricted to the office to answer phones, while the rest of the staff spent entire days away. Any contact I had with families ended. I still had hope I could make a difference. Maybe she would be swiftly removed. Sadly, 6 time zones away from DC, things didn't happen quickly. My great awakening occurred when Tutuila, my island in American Samoa, was under the direct path of a major hurricane. And when it changed course at the last minute and didn't hit us, I found I was furious. When I would rather experience a hurricane than have to sit another day alone in an empty office, I knew I was done. I had worked way too long keeping my bucket intact. My savior complex vanished. The bottle of gripe water meant nothing. I left that week having no job to return to, no opportunity to tell families goodbye, and an abrupt end to my love of snorkeling. I was eventually rehired by Fresno Unified, but never to work again in the infant program. Was I disillusioned? Absolutely, and very humbled, but I also learned I was resilient and courageous. And I was thrilled when 6 years later, the director was offered prison or retirement. She took retirement. I want to thank you for listening to my reflections, and after a minute, I would like to reflect on this talk. I would love to hear your attempts to keep your buckets together, and if things got more interesting when the bottom fell out. I will also welcome any questions or comments. Thank you.